I have to start with you, Stella, on just briefly on some of the newsworthiness of your husband, Julian Assange, being able to appeal extradition. Can you just give us a brief overview on what this means for the case, so we can get through the news there?
Yeah. So, as I'm sure most of you know, my husband, Julian Assange, who's the founder and publisher of WikiLeaks, has been persecuted since 2010, ever since WikiLeaks started publishing the information evidencing war crimes and so on in the Middle East and around the war on terror. And that persecution has manifested in many different ways, one involving financial services, which we'll get to. But the legal case against him is a criminal case involving 18 charges in the United States amounting to 175 years, which criminalized journalism. And over the past 5 years, he's been in a high-security prison in London, fighting extradition. And just a couple of days ago, we got the news that he will be able to bring his appeal to the High Court in London, which is really important. And it is, yeah. It's been a massive fight till this point, and it's key that the single issue that he's going to be arguing at the High Court is his access to the First Amendment. It's purely a First Amendment argument. And for years, there has been an attempt to divert, draw attention away from the fact that this is a First Amendment case. It's about freedom of information, about informing the public, and about democratizing knowledge. So,
well, thank you for that, and I want to move the conversation to Bitcoin. And thank you for that update there. Julian Assange has said that Bitcoin is the most interesting intellectual development on the internet in the last 5 years, and he said that in 2014, so that dates back to Bitcoin's inception. What role has Bitcoin played in his work since 2010?
Well, I think I don't know if you're aware of this, but this today is the 13-year anniversary of WikiLeaks accepting Bitcoin.
On the day today?
14th of June, wow. 2011. So I think for those of you who are not too familiar with the backstory, Pete Rizzo, the Bitcoin historian, has just posted a thread about why Julian is a Bitcoin legend. And he goes through the timeline, but basically Bitcoin saved WikiLeaks and enabled WikiLeaks to be able to continue publishing when the attack started. And the attack started on many different fronts, but the financial services were, it was the first time that it was actually a blockade against an organization. WikiLeaks had just started publishing 250, hundreds of thousands of US documents, and there were all sorts of attempts to shut it down, and one of them was to stop donations from coming in, because WikiLeaks is funded by donations. The average donation was about $25, and so Bank of America, Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, etc., all came together to shut down the donations to WikiLeaks just as the counterattack started ramping up. And this was December 2010, and WikiLeaks started receiving donations June 2011. And of course, right at the beginning, there were discussions internally, I think in the kind of Bitcoin developers, about whether WikiLeaks could maybe use Bitcoin, and Satoshi said, it's too early, it's not ready. But 6 months or 7 months later, Bitcoin was ripe for use, and I think WikiLeaks really gave Bitcoin its first massive use case. And it not only shows, the value of Bitcoin in enabling resistance, but I think continues to show what it can achieve. I mean, really, like, the success of WikiLeaks cannot be separated from Bitcoin.
I like the perspective on enabling resistance. When you receive the donations in Bitcoin, like is there a logistics implication where it sometimes becomes a bit difficult to manage that and actually have a practical use case of all those funds you might have in Bitcoin, but then you have other things to buy necessarily that you can't necessarily do that in Bitcoin. Is that a logistical problem there for you, or?
Well, I personally was not involved in that. I know that for several years, WikiLeaks basically had been cut off from donations, and then eventually, and it was only Bitcoin that was keeping it afloat.
So there were no bank accounts, no PayPal. There was essentially it was all.
It was all, and at the time, so this is 2010. PayPal basically had a monopoly over the, electronic donations and so on. But it was only after an organization in the US called the Freedom of the Press Foundation started accepting donations and had structured it in a way that was viable, that it could start accepting fiat donations as well. But for a long time, it became very, very difficult, but WikiLeaks pulled through.
I find that fascinating because that is so interesting in a time when everything becomes so political that Bitcoin has resisted being put in one camp or the other in that sense, by virtue of being a tool. I think just politically, even in the audience, people would have very different views on the world. And interestingly, this is true for people who support Julian as well, because there's a wide political spectrum in that sense as well. Do you see the similarities of, like, there's a principle behind it, there's a principle behind the Bitcoin use case, and there's also the principle behind the First Amendment and being able to do your work as a journalist? I think there's some overlap here. Would you agree?
Absolutely, and I think, like with Bitcoin, what you find with WikiLeaks and Julian's case is that you have allies from, and it's quite rare, from across the political spectrum with very different interests who disagree on many, many different things. But this really goes down to the fundamentals, and I think what we're all talking about is, it's not just why developers should care about what happens to activists. I think what happens to activists provides the broader threat model that everyone else is up against, and understanding that threat model and how it's, what tools are needed to overcome them. And I think that's why WikiLeaks and its survival is a really important case to understand the use of various jurisdictions. And of course, it's not just the financial attack on WikiLeaks. It's had to face up to many, many, reputational, political, etc., and had to move with the broader geopolitical situation. As you know, Julian, for example, he sought political asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy at a time when Ecuador had a government that was resisting US influence, but then there was a change, and that's why he got thrown out of the embassy. But obviously, in terms of survival, organizations obviously don't necessarily have the know-how or the, let's say, knowledge capital to survive the way WikiLeaks did. But I think there's a really important case to understand for everyone in this room, because the regulation around, or the attempts to regulate, Bitcoin, they come out of this same push for censorship that WikiLeaks has been up against, and obviously that's broadened out over time.
So Bitcoin coexists in a world, and we've discussed some of this, that sees the return of authoritarianism in the way that we probably thought that we had gotten rid of. And it tied to a reduction in personal liberty. At the meantime, Bitcoin has enabled this flexibility and connection and privacy and access that we also didn't have previously. So with those two things happening at the same time, do we think that Bitcoin can tip the scale towards more personal liberty? And let's start with you, Stella. If you had to, I'm asking you to make big predictions here, but ultimately, if we had to look to the future, how would you analyze that?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, these processes started almost at the same time, right? And partly in response to one another, where we were in 2010 when WikiLeaks started publishing the Chelsea Manning leaks. That was probably internet freedom at its height. And it's also when Bitcoin, started, well, taking off maybe a bit early for that, but being used and being known more broadly. And I mean, back in I think it was 2011, Julian was explaining Bitcoin to the, I think it was CEO Eric Schmidt of Google, and he had never heard of it before. But 2 years later, he was talking about it in conferences and so on. These trajectories are parallel and in conflict, and we need to fight because the censorship and the crackdown, and I think it's pretty meaningless to talk about authoritarian governments because Julian is in prison because the U.S. wants to put him on trial for 170. He's facing a sentence of 175 years. Like, if that's not authoritarian, what are we even talking about? Julian just published evidence of war crimes implicating the U.S., and the UK has been holding him in the highest security prison the UK has for 5+ years without conviction or sentence. I mean, this is as authoritarian as it gets. So this distinction, I think, is meaningless to my mind, and we're experiencing it, and we need to recognize it. It's happening right now, and all these regulations, they're so benign looking. It's like KYC, and then the banks are just like, well, trying to shed responsibility or tick boxes and so on, and the effect is real, and it is on each and every one of our freedoms. And this process is just taking off, and we really need to form a robust culture and resistance to those tendencies, because they're just continuing and basically accelerating, and there has to be a counterbalance to that.